All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Summer Surface. I'm the Assistant Director of CAP, and we are happy to have you here for our first in our webinar series for spring 2021, addressing inequity in our classrooms. I will be recording this today, and it will go on the CAP publications page. So you can find that there probably sometime early next week, and we'll add any materials that the presenters share. So I'm very happy to introduce our three presenters from Sacramento City College English Department. We have Jesus Limon Guzman, Carrie Marks, and Dawna DeMartini. So I'm going to hand it over to them.
All right, thanks so much for inviting us here, Summer. CAP is one thing that I've really missed during our time apart. And so it's just so nice to be part of this community where I think for me, at least, I feel like I've had this experience to be able to talk through some of my learning and growing as a professional. And so that's really what this is about today. Is for us to share some of our experiences, first individually, and then in terms of what our college is doing around looking at our own data. So I chose this cartoon. It was one of my favorite cartoons out of the New Yorker, just kind of as our title page, because this is what it's like for me in terms of looking at my personal class success data. Is like the hardest part seems like the beginning when I have to look at that data of who's succeeding in my classes and who's not succeeding, and recognize that there is a disproportionate impact connected to race. And that's really hard to accept and acknowledge. But that's just the beginning, right? To be able to acknowledge that and then to say, okay, I've got to do something about that and take action is the most important step. And so that's really what this presentation is about. We're all going to talk about various things that we've learned from looking at our data, what kind of like struggles we've had to go through to actually come to that place of recognition, and then how we've moved on or we are moving on. And sadly, of the three of us, none of us are at the top of the hill. We're all in the doing something about it phase. And so we're going to invite you guys to also join with us in, sharing what to do in that phase. Like, what are some of the things that we're working through? And hopefully as a CAP community, we can think through some ideas for how to continue to make progress. And then at the end of our presentation, we want to share about how to institutionalize this practice. So what has our college done? And my dean is here, and I'm going to invite her to talk with us a little bit too about how to make this a practice that everyone at the college engages in. All right, so looking at our personal class success data is something that I've been involved with for a few years. I've shared about it at CAP before, how I had some disproportionate impacts that I wasn't expecting. But that's something that I've worked through a lot. And if you look at the last 5 years of course success data in my classes, I was feeling fairly good about it. Like, you can see there's not actually any statistically significant disproportionate impact, although I was concerned about the Latinx students who were just a little bit lower. And so that was something that I was aware of and working on, thinking through in terms of my curriculum decisions, my policies, my relationships with students. So I was aware of this, but I also felt like, when 2020 hit, I felt like that's no time to look at data. In fact, I was in a district meeting talking about data last spring, and somebody suggested we needed a meeting to look at the 2020 data. And I was like, oh, absolutely not. Hell no. We all know that's going to be a shit show. Like, let's not even look at it. Let's put a big asterisk next to that and never talk about it again. But then my dean actually kind of forced us to look at our course success data this fall. And so I went back and did that. And that was really something I was resistant to, because I've been struggling teaching online. But here's what I found. Here's my data. So the light blue is basically my data from previous years. And the dark blue is how my students did in 2020. And I was really surprised by this, is that 3 of the 4 groups that we were looking at actually did a little bit better during 2020 when we went online. And that surprised me. And then what also upset me is that the group that had been the most successful in my classes for the last 5 years took a huge drop, and that's African American students. And that really threw me and upset me. Um, but my first instinct was just to say, well, COVID has had a disproportionate impact in terms of the actual disease and the financial impact it's had on African Americans. So it's probably that, right? That was kind of my first instinct. But my dean also made us do some reflection questions, and none of her reflection questions were about who else can you blame for this, right? They were all about focusing on what part are you playing in this. And so I had to really stop and think of that and move on and say, yeah, I don't have control over, what's going on in this country, but I do have control over my classroom. And so I need to focus on that. So what I did really was I had to think through, why were African American students successful in my class beforehand, and what has really changed? So thinking that through, some of the things I've tried to work on in the last few years has been culturally sustaining curriculum, thinking through the themes in my course and the readings and the writing assignments, all of those things. How am I connecting those to my students' cultures? And that's something that I don't think has changed during COVID. That's something I'm still able to do online. So I feel good about that. Equitable grading practices. I've thought a lot about how to try to minimize my own bias in the grading process, how to focus on growth, how to let students bounce back from failure, mostly through contract grading. And that's definitely something that I still do online. So I don't think that's the issue. Intentional class policies, just thinking through, we've done a lot of work at our college and our department, thinking through for all of our course policies, who are they advantaging? Who are they disadvantaging? And that's something I've continued to do during this time as well. But the last 2 things, belief in student capacity and focus on building community and relationships, I think those 2 are really tied together, right? Because my ability to believe in my students' capacity really just comes through my relationships with them. And that's absolutely something that's changed for me during online teaching. That's something I have struggled with the most. And when I was feeling really down about my teaching one day, I went back, and in my email, I have this file where I keep emails from past students, like when they send you something nice or whatever, those nice moments you get. And I just went back and looked through them. And basically every single one was focused on those last 2 things. Like, oh, you really made me believe I was a decent writer and that I can keep getting better. Or you made me feel so welcome every day. Or, I miss the family feeling of our class. Those kinds of things. They seem to be what really mattered to students. And I feel like those are things that are harder for me right now. And thinking about that, like, why wouldn't that just impact all students? If I'm not doing a good job building those relationships, then why aren't all my students, my white students, are doing actually better? Like, all the other groups are doing better. So why do relationships matter, especially for students of color? I think the most important thing to think about is that students may come to us with a history of educational trauma, right? And our relationships with them can potentially disrupt that trauma. So Pedro Noguera writes about this study of high school students in California. And they asked students to identify with the statement, my teachers support me and care about my success in class. And 80% of Black male students disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. So if my African American students are coming to me with this experience of 13 or more years of feeling like their teachers don't support them, don't care about their success, don't have a relationship with them that's positive, that's going to be the default, right? That's going to be the default, is they're not necessarily going to immediately assume that I care. A a student who's had a background where they feel like they have had relationships with teachers all along, their default might be, yeah, my teacher probably cares about me, right? So that's why if I'm not building those relationships, it's going to impact a lot of my Black students more. Learning requires vulnerability, right? It requires being open to the struggle, especially learning writing, but any areas where students are nervous about failure. And that kind of learning happens the best in the context of a caring relationship. And then relationships also promote a sense of belonging, right? And this kind of goes back to the first thing. African American students are less likely to feel like they belong on the campus of a predominantly white institution, right? And so relationships are one of the best ways we can build that. Just even in the face-to-face setting, that's easier because I've got this office. The students will come and visit it long after they've been in my class. They know they can hang out. They know there's snacks for them. They know there's a drawer of toys for their kids to play with when they drop in. I know how to build that sense of belonging. I love that, and in my classroom, baking them cookies and just hanging out before class and after class. It's easy to do those little things, whether it's body language or conversations that build that sense of belonging. But I think relationships also matter for me as an instructor in terms of working with students of color. So one is that relationships help me to make connections between students and course content. If I want to be culturally sustaining in my curriculum, then I need to know my students. I need to know their culture. How else am I going to connect? And if I don't know my students, then the culture I'm going to connect to is my own culture, right? So those relationships help me to build those connections. Relationships can also disrupt bias. So knowing that I grew up in this white supremacist culture, there have to be biases in my head. And the best way to disrupt those is understanding someone as an individual, getting to know them as the unique, amazing human being in front of me. Once I'm able to see beyond biases, then I can maintain high expectations for students, right? Those go hand in hand. And then as I see students' capacity, as I have these high expectations, then those relationships can also impact students' academic self-perception, right? So if I'm able to see the best in them, to see their potential, then they can see that too. So then the question is, how do I build relationships in online classes? And honestly, this is where, I'm on that mountain right now. I am struggling with this. And so I'm going to share some of the things that I'm doing and working through in response to realizing that this is probably a sticking point for me in terms of my African American student success. But I would invite you guys to join in the chat while I'm talking and just share. If you've got ideas for how to build relationships in online classes, I would love to know. And Dawna and Jesus are going to monitor that chat and bring out some of those as well. So feel free to chat those in as I'm talking. How do you build relationships in online classes? For me, and this is probably the hardest one to talk about, but it's probably the realest one. I need to get my heart in the game. This year has just been hard for me, like it is for a lot of people. I find myself feeling isolated, not feeling good about myself as a teacher, feeling anxious, feeling stressed about my connections with my own children and what they're going through during this time. It's just been a hard year, and I find myself emotionally retreating sometimes, right? From a lot of things, from a lot of relationships, honestly. And so I have to take that step of putting myself back in the game. I have to put my heart into it the way that I always have in the past. And that's been a realization I've had recently. Another thing I've realized is that, the curriculum's good enough. It's fine. I just decided for this semester, I'm just use the exact curriculum I used in the fall. I spent about 2 weeks in January working with Dawna, and we, freshened it up, did the best we can, threw some jazz hands on it, and said, that's enough. I'm not working on any curriculum during the semester. It's all up and running on Canvas, but I'm putting all that planning time into actually building relationships, because I think that that's actually the thing that's going to make a difference. If there's another bell or whistle or another cute little visual that pops up on Canvas, I don't think that matters as much as the fact that I'm putting time into connecting with students. I shared before, I love creating those spaces in person where my students and I connect, whether that's in the classroom. We spend a lot of time and money redoing our co-requisite classrooms to try to make them like have this great community feeling. I love, trying to make my office a great place to build connections, but I've got to find ways to do that online. So one thing actually Dawna suggested was doing reflection journals every week. And, I've been trying to write back to my students. Sometimes it's connecting with the course material, sometimes it's metacognitive stuff. And sometimes it's just kind of like checking in, like, how are things going for you? Check-in discussion boards obviously also can do that role. I've been working with Flipgrid more for some of the discussions. So that's a tool that some of you may be using, where students do like little brief videos of themselves in the discussions. And I find just seeing the room behind them, sometimes I make connections, right? With just seeing a student. I don't know what it is, what the magic of seeing them talk, but it helps me feel connected, and I can talk back to them as well in those Flipgrids. Required conferences, trying to do that over the course of the semester with all my classes. I did the co-requisite class I did in week 2. I did another class this week. I'm just coming off of doing 10 conferences this morning. And I thought it would be exhausting, but it's like rejuvenating. It's exciting. Like, I am getting so much joy out of those conferences. Just 15 minutes. It's amazing. Some math teachers turned me on to Slack. And so Slack is like kind of a group texting tool. And I had my classes all sign up for Slack. And so it's kind of fun watching them. And I said, this is your space. If somebody asks something and you seem to need me, I'll jump into the space. But, they're just like talking about what they're watching on Netflix and stuff, which is great. Or, sometimes complaining like, oh my God, you guys, that reading is so long. They're complaining about that this week. But that's great. And then just texting with students instead of just relying solely on email. Sometimes I end up texting them, and I ask them at the beginning of the semester, is that okay? Are you comfortable with that? I had one student who finally turned in an essay late, and we talked over and over about how she was struggling with procrastination, struggling to get this in. And so when she turned it in, instead of emailing her, I just texted her, because, you can send the text with like fireworks and all that stuff. And so I sent her the fireworks, like, hey, you got it in. And she like texted me back these goofy little pictures, somebody dancing. And then, I'm texting back. So it just creates a less formal kind of way to connect with each other. Another thing I'm working on is building relationships before students struggle. Relationships are rarely formed off of just hounding a student to turn in their work. Nobody becomes best friends with the collection agency, right? And that's honestly how I was starting to feel sometimes, is like the only time I try to get to know students is when they're falling behind and not doing stuff. And then I'm like just pestering them, and they tune me out and ghost me, and I wonder why, right? So obviously I've got to build that relationship beforehand. I'm trying to turn interactions into ongoing conversations. So like if, a student just emailed me and said, oh, sorry, I didn't get this done, but I have a new job. And so I was busy. And so instead of just saying like, okay, we'll get it in this weekend, I said, okay, get it in this weekend. Hey, what's your new job? And he emailed back, and then I emailed back, and we just actually got a conversation going. So I'm trying to think of that with emails, instead of how can I end this conversation? How do I keep the conversation going? And then spending time looking for the positive. So Dawna and I were talking about this over the break. Like, how marriage therapists tell you, like, if you just wait to go on a date night with your spouse until you feel like it, you're probably never going to do it. So even though it'd be nice if relationships were just spontaneous like that, realistically, they're just not. And so, just like your therapist would say, every Thursday night, have your date night, or at least when we used to be allowed to have dates. every Thursday night, have your day night. Now I'm trying to do this thing. I have a whole schedule in this little cute notebook that I got where I have 2 times a week where I actually have it in my calendar to send out positive emails. And I have certain students that I have to send it out to that week. And that forces me to go in and find something positive to say to connect with those students. And so that's actually been super helpful for me too, just to notice the positive and then for them to get that positive email of something little that maybe I noticed they're doing. So that's where I'm at. Dawna and Jesus, did we get any ideas to share with me?
Yeah, so one thing I noticed, Sarah Sullivan said something about creating a culture of appreciation. And I know Sarah's a writing teacher, so writing, working that into writing every day, that it struck me because that sounds like something I would think of doing, and then we would do that once and then go back to the regularly scheduled curriculum, right? So I was really inspired by that, like doing it every day. And it was perfect because then a little bit later, Sarah expressed her appreciation for what Carrie was saying. So she was literally living what she is teaching. I love that. Jesus, what did you notice?
Yeah, one of the comments that I appreciated the most was the Megan talked about including quick personalized videos as comments for feedback. I like that. I think I incorporated maybe once, but I want to go back into a habit of doing so, because I do enjoy reading my student papers and I enjoy giving them feedback. The one piece that I often like struggle with is typing out all the feedback and all the notes. And then because I'm always curious, like, did they even read it, right? Were they able to pick up my tone? Did it come off as encouraging or not encouraging, right? So I like the video, a quick video, personalized message, because then it helps students, actually see our messaging, and it could encourage people like myself who do enjoy reading the papers, don't enjoy typing out the feedback. So I like that. I appreciated that comment.
All right, Jesus, do you want to go into sharing your story now?
Yeah. So my name is Jesus Limon. Everybody, I'm a professor at Sacramento City College. So I'm gonna share. I don't have slides. I just have a long-winded story. Um, but I'm gonna encourage folks to have questions, make comments on the chat, and likewise, my colleagues Carrie and Dawna will be watching the chat to pull comments. So myself, I'm also a graduate from Sacramento City College, and that's going to be kind of important to the conversation, because I pride myself in coming from the community that I serve. Right, that's kind of like the purpose of my education was to come back and serve the community. Right, so I went to Sac City College, I went to Sac State. I come from the community. I know most of my students. If I don't already know them, I know their family members, or I know their friends, or we have some shared narratives or shared experiences because of the neighborhoods that we grew up in, the kind of food, the kind of food places we hung out at, I also played sports in the area, like high school sports. So, when I get guys in there and they tell me they went to this high school, and I just kind of give them like, oh man, you guys like, oh, I hate that school. We always used to lose to you or whatever. And so there's all this relationship that I'm able to build with students because I come from the community, because I know them, because I'm engaged. So I always kind of found, as I was preparing to be a faculty member, as I was preparing to be a professor, as I was preparing to be an educator, in my mind, I was like, oh, this is going to be so easy because I'm going to be able to immediately connect with my students. I'm going to know about them. I'm going to be able to build things for them. They're going to love me. They're going to celebrate me. They're going to be like, finally, one of us. Yeah, come here. We love you. I love you too. It's going to be just a whole amazing experience. But it was not that. When my first few semesters, I think it was productive in the relationship. I think what I just described, some aspect of that did happen, right? I was able to build relationship with my students. I was able to have all those conversations that I just talked about. I was able to relate from the perspective of actually being, a student in their seat. I could even relate to the fact that I took a lot of their professors, a lot of my colleagues, were once my professors and across disciplines, right? So I could share even resources, right? In terms of, what counselors to talk to, what are some of the financial services that are available. So I feel like I had a lot to offer. But after, my first few semesters, as an adjunct faculty member, and then even into my, my tenure track, I always had this, I don't know how to call it, but at first I had this bit of fear that I might do better than the standard, right? Like I didn't want to be an outlier, and maybe it was like a bit of an imposter syndrome, right? Like I don't want to be an outlier. I don't want to perform too well, right? And so we used to have these collaborative assessments, right? We normed for a particular writing assignment, and we would grade the assignment together. And whenever I would get my stack back with my student papers, they would be I would be pretty much in line with everybody else, right? At that time, for that particular assessment, I think the pass rate was somewhere around 50% of that assignment, right? And I remember getting my stack back, and one of my colleagues, who was actually one of my professors, she asked me, she said, "How'd you do? How'd your students do?" And I said, "Oh, half and half, half passed, half didn't pass." And she said, don't worry about it. That's the standard. You're just like everybody else. Don't worry, don't feel bad. You did good, you know? And I walked away, and I was like, that didn't feel encouraging. Like that actually the thing that I wanted, which is what, not be an outlier, like just to be as good as everybody else on either level, right? I don't want to be so bad that I didn't fit in. And I don't want to be too good that where they might question my practices. I wanted to fit in with everybody. And when I actually did, I just felt horrible, right? I was like, then what's it all worth, right? Like if I have all this content, not just content, I'm sorry, if I have all these life experiences, if I'm able to connect with my students, if my retention is actually a little bit higher because students stay plugged in, because they know me, because I'm able to just interact with them, what's the value of that if we're still going to get the same results, right? So my pass rate was very similar to most of my colleagues. It wasn't just in that assignment. It was in my success rate, right? And it was across the demographics, right? African American students struggled in my class. Latinx students struggled in my class. White students did, better in my class. It followed the trends. And I had to take, some serious reflection. And I came to the conclusion that out of this fear of wanting to belong, right, to a collective of colleagues, of wanting to belong to the department, out of this, maybe it could be a type of imposter syndrome. I just did everything that everybody else had already modeled for me, right? So my assignments were very similar to the assignments that I received when I was a student, right? My rubrics were very similar to the ones that I was used on me, right? That my colleagues / my previous professors had used to evaluate my work. So like even my assignment, like I know I said this already, but like my writing assignment sequence was very similar, almost identical to the colleague that came up to me and said, "Don't worry, we all do that. We all do about half pass, half fail." And so I started thinking, I was like, "Oh man, like my assignments are just a replicate of my colleagues. Like it's not me in my syllabus, right? It's me in the classroom. I'm able to build this relationship with my students because of who I am, how I talk, how I dress, all these different things. I'm able to build that. It's me in the classroom, but it's them in my syllabus, right? So my writing assignments were a reflection of them. My grading policy was a reflection of them. And actually my grading policy was also a reflection of my professors, right? My graduate professors that had told me, this is what it means to be an English professor, and so on and so forth. So when I thought about it and when I reflected, I found that when it came to the success rate, the things that impact the success rate of my students in terms of the grading policy, the attendance policy, the assignments that I produced, all of those were more reflective of other people than they were of me, right? it was me in the classroom, it was me having conversations, but it was still somebody else's, class, right? So that's when I started engaging with the process of like, okay, well, how do I redefine this, right? And I'll be honest, my first step was I looked at my contract, right? I looked at the faculty contract, like how much academic freedom do I actually have, right? Because I don't want to step out, I want to know what I'm free to actually do, right? What I have rights to do, and so on and so forth. So I read up on the contract. As it turns out, we have a tremendous amount of academic freedom. We get to choose how we grade our students, right? We have all this power that I wasn't utilizing at all out of, all these other things that I already talked about, right? Some fears, some imposter syndrome, so on and so forth. So boom, I start to get empowered, right? I start to feel a little bit more confident. And I start assigning my own assignments, right? I start being a little bit more creative with my assignments. I started being a little bit more creative with my grading policies, with my late submission policies. I started creating other ways to re-invite students into the class that have been disengaging. I start, and then I think towards the end, I feel like I can say this now because that practice is no longer a practice in our college. But at the end of our norming session, or at the end of one of our norming sessions, I just didn't go. Like I just said, I actually don't even have to go to this. I'm not gonna go, and I just didn't go. And I just graded my own students, and it worked out. I didn't get fired. I didn't get nothing horrible happened, and so I, in those moments, I started thinking, okay, I can actually create my class. I can have it be reflection of who I am. I can have it be, even more importantly, start to be more reflective of the strengths of my students, right? So I started tailoring assignments more to match the strengths of the students, right? And so that's where I found myself pre-pandemic, right? Once the pandemic hit, everybody went to online, and again, I was learning again a brand new experience, right? I was learning again how to teach in a new environment, and all of those same fears and insecurities just popped back up, right? And I was like, well, I don't know how to be an online educator, so let me just mimic what everybody else is doing. And guess what kind of results I got? What everybody else did, right? So me and my colleagues would get together, and we would be having these conversations, and everything that everybody was sharing, I was experiencing in my class. And once again, I had to, but this time, more quietly to myself with less insecurity. I was like, wait a minute, if we're all doing the same thing and we're all completely different individuals, we're mimicking something. We're just mimicking some standard that nobody's talking about. We're just mimicking, we're all just operating or reflecting some system, right? Which, if you ask me, and if you ask some of my colleagues here, that system will probably be white supremacy. Right, that ends up being the default in the English classroom, right? So again, I started going back to thinking like, what could I do, right? And at this point, halfway through the semester, I just saw all of my EOPS students, right? Like their engagement was just lowering consistently when I was doing what everybody else was doing, and I switched up some of the things that I did. So one of those things that I switched up was the way the students submitted work. Right, so I evaluated how students submitted work, and I saw that when it was open, a public discussion, students engaged consistently, right? When it was a private submission, the engagement was not the same, right? When they had to submit alone, it wasn't the same. So in my own mind, I started thinking, maybe there's something about that. Maybe there's something about the public discussion. There's something happening in the public discussion in terms of the modeling, right? The more assertive students, the more knowledgeable students, or maybe the students that just feel more confident are going to respond right away, and the students are responding right away. And then the students that don't have the same sort of security are kind of mimicking what they're doing, right? At least that was my hypothesis. So I tried it with a major assignment as opposed to just a reflection or a discussion. And so for an essay, instead of asking them to submit an essay into as a private document, I just turned it into a discussion. I said, just submit your essay into the discussion. And whoever submits it first, the first three, if you submit before the deadline, I'm going to give you immediate feedback so that you can reply to it and respond to it and resubmit before it's due. And so that, I think, I don't know because I haven't fully evaluated it, but I think that triggered more engagement, right? Because I started seeing the engagement go up on the major assignments, right? And then I became just more intentional about it. I just said, okay, if I'm getting more engagement this way, I'm actually going to just prompt students. You know, if you're struggling with this assignment, wait a couple of days, see if your peers are engaging, look at what they're doing. If you see something that you think is working, make a note to them, let them know that you appreciate it, and make an effort to mimic the style, not the content. It should always still be your ideas and your content. But if the style helps you generate ideas, or if a model of the style helps you generate ideas, then go ahead and engage with that mimicry. So that's been my experience, everybody. I told you I didn't have a lot of slides, but just a long-winded narrative of this reflection of or this I hate the word journey, but it has been a journey of like coming to grips with this, like, why am I so afraid to be myself in the space? Why am I so afraid to actually utilize the tools that are present to me? And when I say tools, you know, the academic freedom, you know, once I sort of came across that, once I had that reflection, that sort of struggle with myself, once I grappled with that with myself, then I was able to actually start taking steps. I don't have all the solutions, and some of the solutions that work well with me may not work well with everybody. But I think that if we all engage with that practice of looking of who's actually in our syllabus, who are we mimicking? And if we're not aware of who that is, again, I think then we're operating out of some default system, right? And we should be critical of what that default system is and who it rewards and who it disciplines.
Thank you, Jesus. Yeah, and as a member of your department, I'm really thankful to you to, like, you know, challenging us to break out of that and helping all of us to do that, right? As you discover your journey for yourself, like, that's something that inspires the rest of us as well. Just looking through the comments, also, like, I was kind of interested in what Megan was contributing. And she was saying that, like, in terms of determining the course content, she really does a lot with consulting the students, especially at the end of the semester, saying, like, well, what would you want to read, or what would you want to learn about? And I know that's something you've done in your class too, right? So, like, the more, yeah, we have to bring ourselves into the class spaces, and we have to, like, also bring our students into the space and saying, like, yeah, what do you want to learn about? Yeah,
Yeah.
Dawna, what did you notice in the?
Well, I was noticing a lot of people kind of chiming in and agreeing with Jesus, what you were saying about that fear of being an outlier, not wanting to sort of have, it's kind of ironic, but not wanting your success rates to kind of make other colleagues question your practices, right? Maybe question the integrity of your assessment, right? And I saw a lot of people sort of that resonating with them. Did you want to follow up, Jesus? Or that's a kind of a good segue to my part, but if you have anything more to say.
just to say that all of this was the catalyst for this was looking at our data, right? That the catalyst for the reflection was that moment of you did just as good as everybody else, right? I think that's so key and so important and such a theme of this conversation.
Yeah. I think that's good too, because it's tempting if you do get your individual success data and you see it's the same as everybody else, it's tempting to be like, okay, I guess that's just how it inevitably is. So I really like how your story pushes beyond that. Like, yeah, you can be the same as everybody else, but you don't want to be the same as everybody else. Yeah.
Well, so I hate going third because I really don't want to say anything I was going to say. I just want to keep the discussion going on this. But it does really segue nicely to the data story that I wanted to tell. I won't say data journey since Jesus hates that word. And I do associate that word with, like, the Bachelorette, right? Or whatever, like, we're all on this journey. But I do want to take my data path or talk about my personal sort of relationship with my data. And I want to take it back to when I was first hired full time, which was in 2015. And when Jesus was speaking about that imposter syndrome, I think that for white educators, and while yes, I do have my own struggles with that, I think something different happened. I think we have an additional responsibility and obligation to sort of pave or create the conditions under which all of us can push our practices and push ourselves, right? When I was first hired, I can remember, I'm sure a lot of you can also remember, like the traumatic interview, right, experience. And I remember that what I said about what I believed about myself was true. You know, I remember talking about, you know, what I was proud of in terms of working with disproportionately impacted students, or, you know, what words were we using back then? I think maybe it was historically underserved, or we might have even been using at risk back then. We certainly weren't really, you know, the word equity just kind of came on the scene, right? And I remember saying about, you know, everything that I was saying in that interview as a white educator applying for a position at a college whose students are the majority are students of color, being able to really say, like, yeah, here are my ideas, here's how I roll, here's what I do, you know, all those things that, you know, Carrie talked about in her presentation, the culturally sustaining curriculum. You know, I was like, this is me, this is who I am. And so right around that time, if you all recall, is really when the data conversation started to happen, at least at our institution, at least in the circles I was in, right? That's when we were really started talking about digging into the data, digging into your personal data. And I remember so well thinking like, well, you know, I don't need to do that, right, for myself. I mean, I don't know exactly what my numbers are, but I mean, I'm sure they're fine, right? It's me, you know, and I can picture all my wonderful students of color, you know, and I can see their smiling faces as they pass my class, right? And so I operated under that for a few years, but then in 2017, I participated in a program at my college called RIDA, and I'll say a little bit more about this a little bit later, but you know, we love our acronyms, right? So it stands for Results-Based Instructional Data Analysis. And you might recognize that word RIDA from Jeff Duncan Andrade's article, Gangstas, Wangstas, and RIDAs, right? But anyway, so what that program looked like was we, you know, our faculty research coordinator sent a call out, and we made an appointment with her. She pulled our personal data and she sat down with us and walked us through it, you know, showed us how to understand it, showed us how to compare it to our, you know, the department, to the college as a whole. And I so remember sitting down for the first time and her pulling it up and being like, well, the good news is your data doesn't show much of a disproportionate impact. You know, like there's pretty much no equity gap. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm one of the good white ones, right? You know, I mean, I'm being sarcastic, but that really was my initial response or my initial thought. But then of course she said, but something interesting is here. Look at this. And she showed me, actually, I'll share my screen. I didn't prepare tons of slides for this, but just so you can kind of see, where's my data here? Oops. A little review of Carrie's. So if you can see my drop rates. So in terms of course success, my white students and my Black and brown students were doing the same, but in terms of the drop rate, there's a huge discrepancy, right? I noticed that I was dropping, or students, Black and brown students were being dropped, or they were dropping themselves, you know, far more than my white students were. So in order to have the success rate be so similar, though, what that would mean by necessity would be that I kept more of my white students, but more of them failed, but I kept them more, right? Because otherwise, how else do you explain the similar success rate versus the drop, you know, the disproportionate course retention rate? So that required me to really think through what was going on, right? So like I had to think, well, why are students why are my Black and brown students dropping, or why am I dropping them more frequently than my white students? Why am I keeping my white students around longer? And it would be very easy, kind of like Carrie said, it'd be very easy to say, well, this is a societal problem, right? The students have to work more hours, have more family responsibilities. Maybe they went to, high schools that didn't prepare them, right? However, the problem with that, and by the way, that's not owning our data, right? That Carrie's comment about, there was no question in our dean's, quiz about like, well, and who else can we blame for this, right? So as I'm thinking about, well, the truth of the matter is the majority of our white students are also low income students. The majority, our white students also have external circumstances, things outside of their control that impact their performance in the classroom. So that can't be it, right? So that really forced me to dig even deeper and look at, well, what was happening with these particular students. So I was able to go through my rosters. So we archive our rosters, and I could see, the students that were dropped. And I noticed that, and it says like instructor drop or student drop. And I noticed it was about 50-50, about half and half. It was my students drop themselves versus I drop them. But as I looked at it a little closer, I noticed that of the students that I dropped, a lot of them dropped sort of upon my loving guidance and advice, right? So sure, there were definitely some students who dropped and I had no idea why, and I never heard from them again. They just kind of disappeared, and hopefully they won the lottery and they are living on some beautiful island somewhere. But the majority I could see that dropped, I actually encouraged it. And really thinking about me encouraging my students to drop or dropping them forced me into trying to understand like why I might do that more for my Black and brown students than for my white students. And that type of confrontation with your own data, I mean, it's painful, right? I have been doing my own sort of work and learning about racial bias, right? Understanding racial bias, and especially in higher education. And it requires me to recognize that I'm just as implicated, and that's not something that I can ever be free of, right? Because what I noticed is, and you guys, I'm a digital hoarder. I don't want to make light of that term, but I do save like every email. And so I could go through in my email and look at some of the, just search the student's name. And I could see that a lot of the conversations that I had about them dropping or me dropping them was that I would use this phrase, this line: I'd rather drop you than give you an F. And a lot of the time that would be preceded by some kind of justification related to a policy. So I might have said something like, and by the way, this was either in email or face-to-face. Sometimes I would ask students to stay after class for a minute and talk to them. And I'd say, according to college policy, missing 6% of class hours considered excessive. As so far you've missed this many, which is way more, and that's why your grade is so low. And I'm not sure that this is the right semester for you to be in my class. Other things I would say is like, well, the late policy in our course is this. It's there to ensure that you do the work. You've missed so many assignments, or you've turned them in late, and so your grade is this, and it's not looking too good, and I'd rather drop you than have to give you an F, right? I would also say something like, unfortunately you missed class on these days that we did this in-class activities, things that can't be done. They just literally cannot be done outside of class. And, so your grade is like this, and, I know you've got a lot going on. In fact, I would often say, it seems like you have too much going on in your life to succeed in this course. And with my smiling face full of love, I'd much rather drop you than give you an F. And so that's the way I a lot of those conversations would go. And I had to, after thinking through that, I had to ask myself some really difficult questions. Why is it that when I look at a student of color, specifically a Black or brown student, I feel like their external or life circumstances are insurmountable, whereas I don't feel that way about my white students? Did I know that I was feeling that way? No, but the data really does bear it out. And so what is it about white students, missing a class here or there, not turning stuff in, and me not seeing that as there's really only two possibilities here. You're either going to fail or I'm going to drop you. And I'd rather drop you because that feels better for me, right? If you notice, this is really more about me, right? Speaking about me, all of these policies that I use to justify that whole idea of it looks like this semester isn't your semester, are all things that I put in place, right? Even that college policy about attendance. I mean, let's all be real honest right here. How many of us, stick to our college policy to the letter, right? Like we have so much emphasis and influence about that in our own classes. And so coming to terms with that, I really feel like it was the catalyst, that confrontation was the catalyst I needed to make some significant changes in terms of the way that I constructed my course so that I could no longer use those policies, or those policies wouldn't be such that they were there to be that justification for me to even have that idea in the first place. Does that make sense? So it's like, I'm almost like, it's beyond just being aware of my own bias, but I'm like tricking myself into not even being able to access that bias to begin with. And I happened to come across a quote just a few days ago, and it's perfect because it captures what I was thinking about after going through that process. And the quote is from this anarchist anthropologist guy, David Graeber. The quote is, "The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make and could just as easily make differently." And even though I didn't have this quote at the time, like that type of thinking of like, well, everything I'm doing in my class is what I have control over. Do I have control over my students' experience, their life? No. Do I have control over how much they work? No. What I do have control over is my own classroom, my own biases, and my awareness of my own biases. So I that was like this kind of tipping point, and Carrie knows this. I mean, that was right around the time that we'd both heard about stuff like contract grading. I'm sure a lot of you here know what contract grading is, and we'd heard about it like, oh, that sounds cool, but I don't know. But like, that was the time it was like, it was like, I just, everything just like kind of blew up, and it was like, let's try this, and let me look at, okay, so if I'm using the students' like lack of attending a particular class as a way that, helps me justify that they couldn't do well in the whole class, well, then why don't I have alternative opportunities for all my missed in-class activities, right? Why do I set it up so missing a class would be so detrimental to a grade? In terms of flexible and meaningful due dates, right? Not getting rid of due dates entirely, of course, but making them more meaningful, building assignments so that the scaffolding and the sequencing of them is so clear as possible to the student, so that they see why it's so important to do it at a certain time as opposed to later. And I know that we have a few other pieces to get to. So I just want to say that, well, let me say this. I didn't bring this into a slide, but it's hilarious because my data for 2017 so that was the semester that I went through that program, and I saw my atrocious course retention rates. I have 0 drops. I dropped 0 people. And so I think that was a bit of an overcompensation swinging the other way. But as it definitely helped me assess and create new policies that ultimately, that for one thing, my retention rate got much better after that. And it also let me what am I reaching at here? It helped me sort of adjust to what my new understanding of the way that I'm teaching. And of course, when COVID happened, that required a whole new adjustment, right? And I know that for a lot of you here, you will have had that same experience of seeing how much our students struggled in spring when we made that sudden remote transition. And so I used a lot of what I was trying to do there, which is just like, okay, just hang on, hold on, guys, like we can get through this, just hang on, hold on, and kind of creating policies for fall based on that. And then finding that those didn't work as well. And so one of the questions I have, and you can just put this in the chat, I'm actually going to stop share for a sec. And, because I'm still learning, right? Like I'm here, I'm still learning, I'm still on this data sort of path and understanding and process and my own learning and understanding how to be and embody anti-racism. And so if you want to put in the chat any idea that you have, something that you implemented for COVID that worked well, like whether it's a policy or whatever that worked well, and that you'll keep it and take it with you even back when we return, if we return on ground again, or if there was a disaster something you implemented that was a disaster that you'll definitely never do. If you want to put that in the chat and just, let us know, because it's good to learn from disasters, right? Cautionary tales. But what I ended up doing in the fall is being really flexible with due dates and deadlines, and just really telling students, like, if you can just get this in, I don't care when you get it, just get it to me. And I feel like I spent a lot of, I know I spent a lot of time just trying to track down students, constantly texting them, begging. I was begging, please just turn this in, or, when can you get that? Can you get it soon? And hey, how's it going? And are you working on that? And, and it didn't work. I mean, like I'm sure a lot of you, I ended up having a lot of drops in the fall. And some students got through maybe who wouldn't have otherwise gotten through, but it didn't feel super good having students kind of do this kind of cramming. Here's 3 papers at, the final deadline was what, 11:59 p.m. and you got me 3 papers at 11:58, and okay, like you got them in, okay, but did that feel good? Was that good for them? I don't know. So something that a student said in a focus group that we had on at our school that I helped organize, actually, a student said that, and this really had a big impact on me. She said, in this time when our home lives are upended, our school lives are upended, everyone's at home or everyone's out working, and we're worried about our family members and friends who are out working, when we know for a fact that there is so much good Netflix to watch. And I mean, right? Am I right? It's like there's just so much that can, when in a time of malaise and just that feeling of unsettled. She said, when I have to sit and try to get myself to do an assignment, and my teacher has told me, like, it's okay to just get it to me when you can, that's really hard for me. It makes it a choice for me rather than a feeling that it's an obligation that I need to do it. And she said, when a instructor puts a serious deadline on something, it helps me, because it tells me that it's an important thing for me to do, and it's an important thing for me to do now. And it helps me make that choice. And as she was speaking, it was really resonating with me, because I was thinking, like, oh yeah, I'm that exact same way. I mean, how many of you have made the joke last semester, I wish I could drop all my own classes and then just re-enroll when we come back face to face. I would do that, right? I would, except for, there's a small problem of having to pay, bills and stuff. So I can't do that, right? It's that sense of obligation and seriousness with what I'm doing. And so I implemented some strategies this semester to try to build in meaningful deadlines, in the sense that really communicating to my students that here's why I'm asking you to do this at these times. And so I think Carrie kind of mentioned this, but I have in my advanced composition critical thinking course, I have them do weekly reflection. That's their Sunday assignment, right? So I'm sure a lot of you follow that best practice of like having 2 due dates a week. So the due dates for my class are Wednesdays and Sundays. And that's another thing that came up in that focus group with students, is how much consistency is so incredibly important for them. And so when I built my class for spring, or my classes, I made sure to have, I had really consistent types of assignments. So like the Wednesday assignments were the more discussion based or social kind of, sharing type assignments. And then the Sunday assignment was always a reflection. So it was something that only I would see. And it was a very metacognitive activity. So asking them to both, reflect on their own, connect the course material for that week to their own lives in an authentic way. A lot of the times I asked them to return to the assignment they did on Wednesday and shared with their classmates and compare, just notice what their classmates, took out of, say, a reading or whatever. And how did their own analysis kind of compare to that? Did their classmates notice something they didn't? And why do they think they kind of overlook that? And it's been a really powerful experience for me to be able to read those, but kind of the best part of it is I was able to say the purpose of these reflections is to show your thinking at the beginning of our time together, and then in the middle of our time together, and then at the end. And so just about 2 weeks ago, as we're coming up on the middle of our semester, I sent out an email to 4 students. And by the way, I have 2 sections of this course. So of a total of 55 students, there were 4 students that I had to send an email to say, hey, just a reminder, these early reflections, like pretty soon you can't do those anymore. It's over because we're going to be in the middle, and your thinking in the middle won't reflect your early thinking. So if you're going to do these, I hope you do these, because I don't want you to get zeros for these. But if you're going to do them, you got to do them now. And just here's when I need you to do them by. But you let me know when's a good deadline. You set a deadline for yourself. Just let me know what that is. And I got a positive. So now I have, everyone is up to speed. Every single one of those 55 students has turned in every single reflection assignment. And I really shouldn't have started. I shouldn't have shared this, because I'm probably jinxing it, right? We'll have to do like an update. Just, talk to me in week 16 and I'll tell you all how it goes. But yeah, so I don't know, did Carrie or Jesus, did you notice anything in the chat, anything that can help us all here?
There's so much good stuff. I'm really enjoying reading through these, but like one of the things I noticed that I think Molly and Janie mentioned was just this practice of giving students options for how to do assignments. Like, does it always have to be an essay? And it depends on your discipline too, but like, could I do a video and a reflection? And, like, are there other options I can give students? And I think that feels really powerful in this time right now. When things can be monotonous for us all, and so to have something that students could get excited about doing was cool. And then a lot of people I noticed, like Megan and Summer, were talking about how with late work, it's the practice of having conversations around it with students, right? And so that kind of goes back to what I was saying about relationships too, building relationships so you can have a conversation. What's going on? What do we need? What's a good deadline for you? Kind of like what you're talking about. Yeah. Jesus?
Yeah, one of the things that I liked was a comment that somebody made about a co-writing assignments. So I think, and the reason why that stood out is because a lot of my writing experiences and outside of being a student have always been co-written, right? So if I'm writing, if I'm writing a report, or if I'm writing a grant, or if I'm writing an article, or if I'm preparing for a presentation like this, there's so much collaboration that happens. So I like that element of, introducing that, right? In terms of real world writing applications, that it's rare that our students are going to write in silos, right? So I think that we could utilize this opportunity to start introducing that concept and that practice. Yeah.
Do you want to, Jesus, do you want to take us to the next slide? We have, we've talked a little bit about sort of our own, how we've engaged with our own data, but how do we institutionalize this, right? How do we operationalize this so that so it's not just individuals doing it, but how are we doing this at a department and at a college level?
Yeah.
Take it away.
I will take it from here. Let me make sure.
Oh no, my drop rate again. Wait.
Oh no. Yeah, so in terms of institutionalize the practice of individual data analysis, sorry, I had to move my little squares. The essential components are easy access to data, the success rates, the drop rates, but more importantly is the having disaggregated data in terms of race, ethnicity, income, gender, first time in college, and then comparison to department and college. So this is something that our department started practicing. I think really as soon as I got to the department, there was those sort of informal sharing, the informal conversations around pass rates. But once we started becoming a little bit more focused around data and actually utilizing the institutional resources to look at our data, then the conversation started to shift, right? So they went from conversations in the hallway to more intentional and really inquisitive conversations around, how are we doing in relationship to each other? How are we doing in relationship to other departments, to other colleges, and then really having some hard conversations about some of our students that are most disproportionately impacted, particularly our African American students, as they went through a writing course sequence, right? So having access to that data inspired or made it possible for us to have those conversations. So that's a key component of the practice, right? Is ensuring that the institution, the members of the institution have access to that data.
Will you flip it to the next slide really quick, Jesus? And I saw a question in the chat about what dashboard that we use. So when I talked about RITA earlier, that was back in 2017. That was when our faculty research coordinator, she had to pull our individual data because that was not, we weren't able to access it on our own. Now, as of maybe last semester, was that the first time it was rolled out? We now have the ability to just log into our data portal. We can see it for ourselves. And so, which is really nice, but I do have to say that having someone go over it with you is really helpful, to help you understand like what it means. And so that's why a program like RITA can be really helpful. And also we have a program at Sac City called Teachers for Equity. And that's a volunteer-based 2-semester cohort, like professional learning community, essentially. And as part of that program, everyone, and we started doing this right around the same time RITA was born. That group as a collective would have their personal data pulled, and then the faculty research coordinator would go in, do a presentation, have people look at their own data, and then it was all about using that space or that professional learning community as an incubator, if you will, for practices, change ideas, praxis, right, growth, and in terms of how you deal with the data, because that's the main thing. It's one thing to like see the data, confront the data, but then it's what do you do about it, right?
So yeah, and that's been something that it originally was just like these groups that wanted to do this. So it was like RITA was self-selected, Teachers for Equity was an ongoing group, but this year, everybody on campus has kind of had to do this through our dean. So I want to take some time to bring our dean on right now. Jesus, would you stop the screen share? Thank you. So our dean is Robin Ikegami. She's our dean of language and literature. So if she can unmute herself, Robin, I was hoping that you can talk about how all of the deans at our college took this on as a project to, in some way, have their departments, every individual in the department, look at their success data and process that. So, Robin, could you talk a little bit about why you guys as deans decided to take that on?
Okay, so hi everybody.
Hi, Robin.
Hi. Yeah, so the deans at Sacramento City College, I think it was the first year when I was the interim dean, so this was in 2017. All of the instructional deans participated in a year-long cohort with CUE, the Center for Urban Education. And as part of that cohort, so we would meet every month for an entire day. So like 8 hours, about once a month, sometimes more often. And basically what happened there is we just kind of got immersed in pedagogical issues and but mostly about data, how to, what data was available, how to understand the data that we were getting, and so basically that. So out of that experience, our Dean's Council, which is basically all of the instructional deans along with the associate vice presidents of instruction and the vice president of instruction, our Dean's Council created an equity subcommittee, and we just started thinking about, how can we encourage faculty to really look at the data that's available and make some progress in terms of closing gaps for closing equity gaps. So that's basically how it came about. There was a lot of concern about the faculty union and in terms of, how administration was going to use the data potentially, would the data be used in performance reviews and things like that. So there was a lot of discussion around how the data would be provided, not just to individual faculty members, how individuals would be able to access their own data, but then also what data would be available to deans.
And I know what your practice was in our department, which I thought worked really well for me, at least, was, we got this quiz on Canvas that just appeared on our to-do list. And so it's like this quiz, like looking at your data quiz. And so we had to go in. And the first step was that it provided a link to this new spot where we could just get our own individual course success data, which is something, before we previously had to request it. And here it just kind of shows up. So we have a link to it. So now we know where to find it. And then we have to look at it and go through and answer a series of questions. And then I was actually surprised that you actually wrote back for those questions, which I thought was nice. I thought I was just going into the abyss somewhere, this quiz, but you actually responded to all of the things and engaged in that conversation with me that way, which I thought was a cool approach. And it was kind of probably good for you because you could just, you could kind of see that everybody was actually doing it and continue that conversation. What are some of the other approaches that some of the other deans did?
So each dean felt like, the faculty in various departments are kind of, everybody has different personalities and different ways of approaching things like this. And so some of the other, in our division, language and literature, which would be English and English as a second language and journalism, I felt like our folks had already done, a lot of work in terms of understanding issues of equity and, trying to improve their own practice and reflect on their own practice. So I felt like this Canvas quiz would be appropriate for us to use that. That way I could still give people kind of engage in conversations with people around their data and around these issues through the Canvas quiz. But other deans felt like that approach wasn't really going to be appropriate for faculty in their areas. And so some of the deans, especially in the large divisions, decided to instead meet with departments or meet with smaller groups of faculty to talk about their data. And so they would ask the folks to look at their data first, and then, after looking at the data, come to this little meeting ready to talk about what to do with the data. And then in smaller divisions, the dean actually was meeting with individual faculty members one-on-one. And from what I've heard, some of those conversations were some of them were really productive. Some of them were very interesting. Some of them, I guess they were scheduled for half an hour, and some of them went an hour. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. So it was all across the board.
I think, one of the common themes though for all of them is like, because I remember at one point you and I had just talked about like, well, let's just get everybody's data and just stick in their mailbox and let them, just throw it at them and they'll open up and be surprised. But what works better, what I think is neat that you're all doing, is that you're in all these cases, you're initiating a conversation, and it sounds like some people maybe were still in the blame everybody else mode and whatever, but that's something that maybe people have to work through, right? People have to go through that. In terms of,
and I think, that we were really concerned about having faculty feel like this was something constructive. This is something useful to do. This was informational. And now, here's your information. You're the content expert. You reflect on how to use this data and how that's going to inform your own practice. We really wanted to emphasize that it wasn't about the dean coming in and saying, you really messed this up and you need to fix it, and you're a problem child.
And somebody was just asking in the comments, were you able to do this with adjunct instructors as well?
Yes. I sent the quiz to everyone in the division who had accepted a Canvas invitation. So it was 117 faculty. Let's see, we have 39 full-timers. So 31 out of 39 completed the quiz. So that's about 80%, I think. And see, I'm getting better with data too. I can figure out percentages now. And let's see, our adjuncts, though, not quite as many participated as I had hoped would, but I think it partly has to do with what kind of data was available at the time, because some of our adjuncts teach in programs that we didn't actually have data for. And so even though they tried to do it, they were like, there is no data for me. So among the adjuncts, we had about a 45% completion rate for the quiz.
And have you seen, what were some of the better results of this in terms of the conversations you've had with faculty? Have you seen any outcome or any benefits to this?
Well, I think that what was really encouraging to me was how many people really seriously were reflecting on their data. Even people with really good data had some really great reflections about, what more they might do, or they had different ideas that I felt were worth sharing with others. And so I kind of compiled all of the responses and shared it on our Canvas page with the division, but I also shared it with the instructional deans because I thought some of the ideas could be adapted for other departments as well. And I think also that I feel like I haven't actually looked at the numbers yet, but I feel like we have more participation in our communities of practice, where more faculty seem to be interested in attending those. And just in terms of looks in our division Canvas page, I have a module where I've collected some resources on anti-racist practices and culturally responsive pedagogy, and it looks like we're getting more hits on some of those resources than we were getting before. So I'm encouraged by that. It's really hard now, though, of course, as everyone has mentioned, being totally online, because I feel like one of the questions on the quiz was, what can a dean do to, to reach out to students more and to have more contact with students who might be feeling unwelcome or struggling in class. And a lot of the suggestions were great, but they all had to do with being on campus.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I see like somebody just left a comment about how there is this fear of faculty that the data is going to be in their performance evaluation. And that's definitely a reason why originally on our campus, we just were doing like self-selected groups, RIDA, Teachers for Equity, other people in these little communities. But it was a little bit of, the choir, right? It's just like this select group of people who really were already engaged in a lot of this work. And it was great. And like, we learned so much and moved on. But this practice, I think, we were afraid to do, but it seems like it's worked out okay. Like people have been okay with getting this data through their deans. And then, yeah, oh, good. Dawna was just mentioning that if you're willing to share that, maybe we could include some of your quiz questions in there. Cool.
Sure, and those questions, actually, the Dean's Equity Subcommittee came up with several of those questions. So, because we wanted to be kind of consistent across the college in terms of the reflection questions we were asking of faculty.
And I think including that question about what do you think the dean can do is just really good, because that shows that it's not a performance evaluation. This is a conversation. You're helping us to grow and we're trying to help you grow, and we're doing this together for the sake of our students. So I think that's cool. Awesome. Okay, well, I think at this point we can turn it back over to Summer, and I know Summer wanted to wrap up, but thank you so much, Robin, for sharing with us.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I just appreciate your honesty and your vulnerability and your expertise. It was wonderful to hear all your stories and everything you've tried. So thank you for your presentation. Thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate it. I'm going to drop a link in the chat for the rest of our webinars in this series. So we have 2 more coming up. The next is on March 26th. And it's with author Joe Feldman on grading for equity. He's going to talk about some of the theories and practices around grading for equity. And then we're going to hear from some faculty who have been trying some of his techniques. And then our last one is April, I believe it's the 23rd, last Friday in April. And that one is looking at kind of the variation in success rates across course sections, and what are some of the causes of that and some of the remedies that we have. So take a look at those. We hope that you can join us. I did record this, as I mentioned, so we will put it up on the CAP publications page, so you'll have access to that as well as all of the materials. And I will be sending you an email shortly with a follow-up survey. So if you could just take a minute to complete that, it will be a very quick, brief survey on your feedback on the webinar. And I think that's it. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.